Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning to everyone who's online. I'd like to thank you all for a really great use much of our first speaker's time. We have had a few people who have had some emergencies, who had to step away. Again, if you have something like that come up, please reach out to me directly and let me know. I want to make sure that everyone who's attending is able to get the stipend. I just made a brief announcement. We do regular attrition and some individuals who have stepped out. Honestly, if you complete the reflection logs and you're able to attend, even if you have to watch one of the sessions remotely, everyone should qualify for the stipend as long as you hand in a lesson plan and you've completed the reflection logs and done the engagement pieces, which is posting and being involved at wherever you are remotely as well. So if you've got any questions, please reach out to me directly. And with that, I will go ahead and start our session with our first speaker of the day. My only speakers that I haven't written anything down for, because everything I'm going to say is very personal. Mitch Bloomer was here at the Holocaust Center and was the Holocaust resource teacher for 25 years. That's a long time for anyone to be in OCPS in a single position. Passion for and a passion for Holocaust education, for education and for history, like Mitch. Mitch into his position, the comment was, "You've got big shoes to fill," and I don't ever think I could fill Mitch's shoes. I honestly, because his feet are bigger than mine. But also, Mitch is still heavily involved center and also with Holocaust education. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mitch Bloomer back to the podium to speak to us today about Holocaust education and to talk about responses of the Black press to the Holocaust. Thank you, Mitch. And I'm gonna let you put that on.
Thank you. And I just want to warn you that it's okay to fill my shoes, just don't fit into my belt. That's what you want to make sure you don't do. So good morning, everyone. So first of all, why I picked this topic, the Black press and the Holocaust, responses in the Black press. I had three things in mind, really. And the first one was, I wonder if there's anyone in the room who is worried about teaching about American racism because of all of the commentary that's been going on, and hands going up. And I think that there's a really great avenue here. And I'll make comments as we go along as to why I think this is a great avenue. But one of the reasons is because we're using primary source documents here. Okay, you are not giving commentary on American history. You are showing what people from this, and so take one step back from that. You're not advocating this position, although the writers share with you do a great job of advocating the positions that they hold. That's one thing. Second thing is, every time there's a teachers institute or a seminar, one of the big questions that comes up is about the American response. What did America do? Why did they do it? Were they waiting? Did they not do the right thing? Did they not do enough? Whatever. And response included in the discussion of what America did. That's a terrible mistake. African American people are Americans, just like everybody else. They're not second Americans, they're not half Americans. Their response, as you can see it indicated in the press, is American response. And that's something that, when your kids ask you in the classroom, what did the United States, what did Americans think, say, and do? Some of this ought to be in what you're telling them or sharing with them. Okay, that's the second reason. The third reason is because I believe that when we're trying to ascertain what might have been an effective or possible American response, these folks maybe in a way that less obvious to other Americans. And there's a reason for that. And so I'm going to share that with you. Now I did try to make the design of this PowerPoint look like old print. Okay. I believe that when you work with newspapers with kids, newspapers as much as you can, especially because students these days don't know newsprint. Why should they? I mean, for the most part, they don't. And yet newspapers are a particular type of communication. For, if you're going to work with students on articles, your students need to know that they're not just text. Okay, they have a particular style to them. So with that in mind, couple of things just to keep in mind when you're using newspapers. Whenever we're talking what people say, events through the lens of their own experience. So if there's a reason why we can look at African American responses to the Holocaust, it's because the context of African American life was, at least in some ways, different from that of other people, and therefore that's going to come through in what's written. Okay, people always tend to view events through the lens of their own experiences, and because newspapers are, as they say, the first draft of history, then that's going to come through most strongly in newspapers. Okay, and it's important for us to recognize that when we look at the press, a lot of what's from 50 years ago, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, okay, that a lot of what you read, you're not going to recognize what they're talking about, because important to the people at that time, there was a lot of contemporary commentary on it to the people who were living there, but it's kind of gotten edited out over time, because it turns out that what they're talking about isn't one of the big issues that's made it down into our narrative history. To me, when you teach about history, it's important to remember chronology. Always, it's critical. Okay, when people were responding to what was happening, what they were finding out was happening during the Holocaust, they were responding to what they knew at the time. Okay, when we look back at this history, we see it all at once. Okay, we're looking from the top down and from the present all the way back to the past. That gives us a completely different perspective. And I don't mean to be critical, and I'm not speaking to anyone in particular, but there's a frustration of mine that when people talk about I usually mean after World War I to the end of World War II. Okay, you get the beginning of the Nazi Party in 1921, just a year and a half or so after the end of World War I. And then you go all the way through. It's like a 25-year period of time that fits into the era. Okay, and so African-American soldiers who are coming back are having the same experience they've had coming back from other wars, which is this was a war in which we were supposed to be able to express our patriotism, our dedication to our country, our love of democracy, and that was going to, and we did it because it was the right thing to do, but it was supposed to pay off in increased respect and more equal opportunity than what we experienced in the past. Is that generally what happened? It's absolutely not what happened. In fact, what you get is soldiers being lynched, people being incensed to see a black man in a uniform because he wasn't supposed to occupy that position. Now, of course, not everywhere. In fact, not in most places, but the possibility was always there. And that's in every conflict. I mean, you can see from the pictures I chose to show you here, you go back to the American Revolution and the Civil War and Spanish-American War and World War I. It's all there. Okay. And so you get a great American thinker, W.E.B. Du Bois, who says, and by the way, let me just make a side comment here.
Kind of real quick, everyone online, can you hear better now? Is this down? Okay, just testing. All right, we fixed the issue. I apologize. I'm gonna strap Mitch up here and I apologize.
That's all right, I'm fine. Okay. By the way, The Crisis is the journal of the NAACP. And so it does sort of fit into the category of press. It's not exactly a periodical, like a daily periodical or a weekly periodical, but it does fit into this. And so he writes that country, this is the country to which we soldiers of democracy return. It was right for us to fight. The faults of our country are our faults. By the way, is it a bad thing in a democratic society to criticize your country? It's your country. You know, if you have faults, owning up to them, admitting them, and working to resolve them is exactly what you're supposed to do. And so they say, we would fight again next time it's called for. But I love this line. But by the God in heaven, we are cowards and jackasses if now that the to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. And what does he mean when he says the forces of hell? Okay, here's what they mean. And I'm sorry, we've transitioned this to Google Slides. I ended up with every single thing here getting a click, and that was not what I intended. I just want to put it all up there. You have three main things that are these forces of hell. Segregation, in particular, the Jim Crow system, but segregation elsewhere as well. Restrictions on jobs and economic opportunities, and then violence. Okay, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, lynching, and by the way, if you examine the Black press, no matter which periodical you're talking about, lynching is probably the #1 thing that's written about. Now, that doesn't mean lynching's happening every day, but actually lynching is happening almost every day. There's on Fifth Avenue in New York, the NAACP had headquarters, and they would fly a flag outside of their building that says, "A man yesterday," and that flag was flying almost every day. Okay, over 5,000 African-American people were lynched in the period, the end 1800s up through 1950 something, 52 or something like that. And that doesn't mean that was the last of it, but about when they say the nadir of the African-American experience. And it doesn't really end in the 1920s. I think what you can see is that if things go right, it could be, coming down a bit, but they have to go right. Making things go right is going to be a hard effort. By the thing, I don't know if who in here teaches US history at the high school level. So you're teaching this period. So do your kids know that one of the bright spots from the Federal Civil Service was integrated until President Wilson presided over its segregation? Did you know that? Yeah. In some areas, things were not getting better. They were getting worse. Not everywhere, not in all time, but some of this. Okay. By the way, my journey from somebody who loved history, American history in high school, to the high hill of my old age now, probably no one in American history has lost reputation and been diminished in my eyesight as much as Woodrow Wilson. In all likelihood, our most racist president of the modern era. And that probably includes some more recent folks. Very, very interesting. And it's not at all surprising to me that his name is being taken off buildings at Princeton. Probably should have happened before. So anyway, this is the context of force. Now, I'm going to back up just 1 second because this session is that come through the Black press. And it's really important that we understand this. The Holocaust happens not all at once, but overlapping stages. Okay, and those essentially are segregation of Jewish people within Germany, loss of rights, loss of privileges, removal of influence, 2 to 3 years. Then tension and intensity, the goal becomes, and it was from the beginning, but it becomes more obvious that pressure is being put on Jewish people in Germany to try to get them to leave. Now, Nazi Germany can't force them to leave at this point because they have nowhere to go. Nazi Germany can't send them outside of the Reich where they can go. So if Jews are going to leave, it's going to be with the cooperation. Okay, so that forced or that coerced immigration, that lasts up to the beginning of the war. Okay, now when the war begins, now Nazi Germany takes territory to the east. Now they've got somewhere they can force Jews to go. They can send them into occupied Poland. But they don't want to just let them go and stay free, of restricting their environment. And that's ghettoization. Ghettoization is another form of expulsion. It's removing Jews from the community and putting them into some other location. And that goes on, I say 1941 plus, because there's still some ghettos being formed in 1943. But for the most part, the in ghettos is late 39. The genocidal mass killing. Now, let's be honest, okay? When people talk about the Holocaust, which one of those 4 stages think about first? The last one, yeah. Mass killing and genocide. Okay. In 1941, what was the United States in position to do to stop Nazi Germany from carrying out genocidal mass killing? Even by 1940, after the war begins, it's very difficult immigrants here. Now, not to say there's none, there's always around the edges. Okay, and in fact, some of the great rescue stories come around Martha and Wade Still Sharp, getting people in, but around the periphery. Okay, but like somebody had written, well, maybe we could, we should have just sent troops into the concentration camps. What does that mean? And first of all, we're not quite at war yet, not until the end of 1941. But if we had the ability to send troops in, what does that mean? It means we won the war, right? I mean, you can't just send troops into the concentration camp. Excuse me, guys, we're not taking you over. We're just coming here to the concentration camps to relieve these prisoners. Don't mind us. You know, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, so what could we have done? Well, of course, that earlier period, that's when the immigration thing makes a difference. Okay. Also, what about agitation? What about getting the attention of the public to the significance of the, so that maybe a political response can be formulated by American leaders? And by the way, if you get into this field in depth, there's a lot of controversy around President Roosevelt. Did he do something? Did he do nothing? Was he an anti-Semite? Was he the great rescuer? What role does he fill? Well, I'm not taking a position right now at this moment, but he was a politician and was able to respond to political pressure. Okay, when political pressure gave him cover to act more assertively, to engage in some form of rescue, he could do that. But if that political pressure was not there, and he knew that there were people who also opposed any kind of rescue activity, he couldn't do it. Okay, because he's got to be an effective leader. If he ticks off half of his followers, can he be an effective leader? I mean, there's a hardship to being a leader. You know, you have to lead with firmness, but at the same time, if you get too far out in front of where people are willing to go, you're by yourself, and then nothing happens. Anyway, this isn't a session about Roosevelt, but just to say, I'm going to share with you over the course of the rest of the session 9 excerpts out of the Black Press. Most of them I'm just going to, describe pretty quickly. I am going to put a folder for you into Google Docs that will have all of these plus others. Okay, but they are not easy to work with on the screen, and yet, as I said earlier, I really think you should try to keep the documents looking like newsprint, because that keeps in mind that this is the kind of communication that it is. Now, before I go into the newsprint though, I just want to say, if you didn't respond to the poll yet, that was at the beginning of my session, I'd really love it if you did. But the results that I had right before the session that I looked was that 17% of the people in the room, or in the whole group, said we really shouldn't do any kind of comparison of African-American experience in America and the Holocaust experience for Jews. It's disrespectful, and you just shouldn't do it. Okay, so some people had that opinion. 9% said, well, it might be beneficial, but I don't think we could get away with it in the classroom. Too controversial. Okay, only one person said, well, I think we could do it, but it probably doesn't have any value. It might teach us something about American history, but it won't teach us anything about the Holocaust. Most everyone, 69%, said it can teach us about the African-American experience, American life, and Nazi Germany's anti-Jewish policies and the rest of the world. And I'm glad you said that, because my whole premise is based on that idea. And then finally, one person said we shouldn't be considering American responses by race. We should all be one race, all just one group. By the way, I understand that on a social level, that you don't want to be considering somebody else's racial identity when it comes to whether you're going to be their friend or go out to eat with them or anything like that. But people have their own history and background, and there's no reason to wash that away. So anyway, so if you're living in the context of 1920s, 30s, and I'm not going into the war years yet, so just 1920s and 30s. If you're living in the United States at that time, and you're Black, just consider this, okay? If you see this in a newsreel, or you read about it, is it wrong that this might come to mind? Okay, kind of similar look, right? Okay. If you think about the nighttime, bad things often happen at night, and you think about the Nazi torchlight parades, would it be wrong if this came to mind? Can you criticize that? Okay, now that doesn't mean it's the same. And by the way, comparing does not mean equating. Okay, it does not. Okay, nobody in this room, I think, would say that the African American experience can be equated with the experience of the persecution of Jews during the Holocaust. They were on a different trajectory, but mostly the people who were doing the persecuting had something different in mind. Now, that wasn't maybe necessarily obvious at first. Some people saw it. But in 1933, if you see that torchlight parade and you see this, it doesn't necessarily even mean that the Nazis are more threatening. Not with this history. Okay, if you find out about the concentration camps, the early moments of concentration camps, and this is a photo of Dachau prisoners in 1933. By the way, it's very likely that most of them were not Jewish, just because of 1933. Most of them were probably socialists, members of the German Socialist Party or the German Communist Party. By the way, those are two separate groups. Okay, but if you are aware of this, it might bring to mind a common American tradition, convict leasing. This is a picture of four Florida young men from the early 1900s, and it was well known, even at that time, that often the young men mostly who were arrested, that those were trumped up charges just to get free labor. Okay, so you can have that come to mind. Okay, now what about these famous segregation signs in Germany? Jews not wanted here. Jews keep moving. If you become aware that these signs are popping up around German towns under the Nazis, could you perhaps forgive somebody for having this come to mind? Sundown towns, white neighborhood signs, and this has been going on a lot longer here. Okay, and of course, very famous photo of a restricted seating in a park in Germany. But of course, you could have seen that all over the United States, mostly in the South, but not exclusively in the South, in areas like transportation and recreation. Okay, now this is a photo of some Jewish men being arrested and marched to a concentration camp. But if you saw that and were aware of it, is it possible maybe that this could come to mind? You know what that picture is? That's Tulsa. That's African American men being marched to custody during, and by the way, I do object to, this is commonly done. This is called a race riot. It's not a riot. It's a massacre. Okay, it's not a riot. And we didn't have a riot in Ocoee. We had a massacre in Ocoee back in the 1920s, Rosewood. Okay. And of course, this is another famous photo from the Holocaust, where a man and a woman a Jewish man, a non-Jewish woman, are humiliated in public because they have a relationship. But if you see that, might it also bring to mind a much more common American tradition that an African-American man who is accused of a relationship with a white woman might experience a lot more than just humiliation. Because the claim was, this is why lynching happened. By the way, it's important to recognize, look at the middle of this poster right here. Is rape the cause of lynching? It says 83 women have been lynched in the United States and the lynchers go unpunished rather. So it's not always what it was claimed to be. And by the way, not everybody who was lynched was African American, but about 70% were. And in other parts of the country, it's mostly people in minority communities, not exclusively, but mostly. And you can see lynchings really last from the end of Reconstruction. And this map says 1968. They got really rare in the end of this period, but they were not really rare during the time that we're looking at in this presentation. So in the African American community, the consensus opinion that comes out in the press is that this is a great country, but it needs a house cleaning. And Germany, great country, wonderful culture, but it needed a house cleaning. And that's the political cartoon that you see right there. Civilization needs to take a broom and get rid of the dirt that's bedeviling both of these societies. So now, there's a couple of themes that keep coming up over and over again in the press that I was looking at. One of them, and this one was written about a lot more and early than what I might have expected. You know, I would have expected to see this in 1938, 39, when military tensions in Europe were increasing. And then when the war began, that you get more and more African American voices saying, we need full access to serving in the military. But this was consistent going all the way back to 1932 and 33 when I first started looking at the sources. So this was something that was on people's minds. Of course, there's a lot, and this is probably the most common theme, the hypocrisy of those white Americans who opposed Nazism, but didn't have anything to say when it came to segregation, discrimination, and lynching. Okay, I will give you, when I put the folder up, 5 or 6 different examples of articles that say precisely that thing. On the other hand, there was a lot of talk about the need to make alliances with other minorities, especially Jews. You know, Jews in America should understand what we're going through, and the more they become aware of their brothers and sisters in Germany being persecuted, the more they will recognize that we're in the same boat here and we can work together. Now, there were subtopics there. Some people said, yeah, and by the way, the recognition or the definition in all of the African American press that I studied was Jews are white people. Okay, they may not have been considered that way by everyone, but they were seen that way by African American people. And some said Jews are like white people, and yet they're a little bit better, but not always. Other people said, no, they're not any different. They're no better than the Protestants or the Catholics. They treat us just as bad. There were people who said that. And then there were those who jumped in and said, hey, you can't stereotype. Everybody acts as their own individual. But it's kind of fun when you look at the press. One of the interesting things about newspapers is, especially when they have a strong editorial section, you get conversation going back and forth between different writers and people writing into the paper. So you'll see in a letter to the editor, it says, I read the article in your paper last week, and here's my response to it. So it's almost Talmudic in its conversation over time.
Is there any evidence in the press of how Jewish people immigrated to the U.S. actually did treat African Americans? What's the record?
You know, not in the press, because most people, I mean, there's a few cases where somebody might be mentioned by name, but usually, and please remember that back in those days, papers had stronger editorial functions. So the editors of a paper would not be likely to publish something. Today, it could be on, you know, anything that somebody wants to put up on the internet can be scandalous and scurrilous, and there's no editorial filter. What was more likely is that if somebody made a statement about, hey, you know, the Jews are just as bad to us as all the other white people, the next week somebody would write in with a letter to the editor that says, no, wait a minute, this Jewish person, like Julius Rosenwald, for example. Have you heard of Julius Rosenwald? Anybody in here teach in Seminole County? Hey, you remember you used to have Rosenwald School? Okay, it's not still open, is it? Okay, I spoke at Rosenwald when I worked here in my early days. So Julius Rosenwald dedicated millions of dollars to building schools for African Americans all over the South. Our Rosenwald School here was one of them. Okay, so somebody would write in and said, hey, wait a minute, you know, what about Julius Rosenwald? He's Jewish, and he's really a friend of the Jewish community. So that's the kind of thing that would come out. Now, one of the things that that happens is, and I didn't include any of this text in this presentation, but I can remember enough to share it. In early 1938 to maybe mid 1938, there were a lot of articles that began to come in about are Black people anti-Semitic? And I wondered, why was there a big spike in articles asking, are Blacks anti-Semitic? And then I found out there was this rabble rouser in Chicago. His name escapes me right off the top of my head. He went to Harlem and started agitating among African Americans to say the Jews are your enemy. He was a real anti-Semite. And so in the Jewish community in New York, there were commissions that were brought together to say, is this actually turning Black people against us? And there were studies and reports and things like that. And it all gets talked about in the paper. Okay. And, you know, we probably don't talk much about some rabble rouser from Chicago going to Harlem and stirring up trouble. It's one of those things that kind of gets dropped out of the history because it ended up being just a flash in the pan. It didn't create some huge movement or anything like that. But in the first half of 1938, maybe going to the second half, it's a big enough thing that there's a lot of articles being written about it. Okay. Also, and this is a bigger deal. There's a lot of talk in the Black press about the conflict that's coming and that comes out in World War II as not being just about Italian or German aggression and territorial conquest, but rather that these things were just an extension of the imperialism that had characterized the world since the late 1800s. And in that view, the Italians and the Germans might not even be the worst, because these great colonial empires were by the British and by the French. By the way, what country in Europe had the most hideous record in African colonialism? Yeah, it was Belgium. Nobody thinks about Belgium in a negative light during World War II, or even World War I. It's the poor Belgians. Well, their reputation in Central Africa was the absolute worst, and it was deserved. So a lot of people who knew that are not writing about the coming conflict and in the early days of the conflict the same way as it gets written about in maybe the New York Times. Okay, it's a different perspective. And although it doesn't ultimately become a huge movement among African Americans, in the 1920s, there was real communist outreach from the Soviet Union to African Americans. And by the way, that continues after World War II. It actually is resurgent again after World War II. And what is it that makes the communists believe that they can reach out effectively to African Americans? What makes them think they can be successful at that?
There's supposed to be equality.
Yeah, and not racist.
Yeah.
It's like, we communists, we're not racist. We're the only ones. You know, yeah, you see the Germans are racist, and you see that the Italians, and by the way, there was a lot of writing in the Black press about the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. A lot. And some of the commentary on, you're complaining about what the Nazis are doing to Jews, why am I not hearing any complaints about what the Italians are doing to the Abyssinians? Okay, and there's a lot of it that says we should be repulsed by what Nazi Germany is doing in its treatment of Jews. But while we're repulsed by that, we should also not neglect to mention these other things. Okay, now here's the first little bit that I wanted to share with you. By the way, Steve, you're gonna have to let me know. I'm not wearing a watch, so.
You have 15 minutes.
Okay, good. What's obvious about the date from this little blurb? Ooh.
Hitler's not power.
That's right. This is before Nazi Germany. Okay. Jewish actors are being barred from the Berlin stage because theater managers fear disturbances from fascist followers of Adolf Hitler. Of course, what's happening in 1930 and 31 is this is the first really successful surge of the Nazis, where they move from being a fringe political party to a major player on the scene. And so even before they become the leaders of Germany, the impact of their anti-Semitism is being felt. And I put this as kind of an early warning, because isn't this the way that racism works? It doesn't always have to be legally enforced. It can be socially enforced. And if it's ubiquitous enough, then people conform without even thinking about it, unless they make a principled decision to resist. And you see that happen. Okay, now, so here's a significant date as well. Okay, April 1st, 1933. What happens on that day? I kind of gave it away, but I mean, yeah, you got this the Nazis create this one-day boycott of Jewish businesses. Okay, and it's really just them flexing their muscles a bit, and especially letting American Jews know German Jews are in our hands. Okay, but it's reported in the press as Jewish pogroms. That's good. That's strong. Okay, especially because it wasn't necessarily the boycott wasn't necessarily attended by extraordinary violence. But as soon as Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany, there was a wave of violence across Germany. Sporadic, yes, but all over the country. And it says, you know, how's it described there? Germany has launched a campaign of terrorism against Jews, driving them from their jobs, beating them and killing them. It's one of the most enlightened countries in the world, and Germany has suddenly descended to the murderous level of Poland. Okay, poor Poland, but you know, there was truth in that. And Romania. Okay, What have we learned from this? Now, by the way, this is, I put this one in here, and it goes on to the next page, because these writers aren't always correct. They say things that don't, they're not always right, okay? So like, for example, there was one writer, not in this article, who said, you know, the Jews get persecuted, but they bring it on themselves a lot because they refuse to assimilate. Okay, now, in the entire history, in all of European history, what was the most assimilated group of Jews? Anybody know? The most assimilated to the culture where they lived. Germany, absolutely. I mean, you know, it's not quite as apparent today because a lot of things have happened since then. But the reform movement, of course, we have an expert in it. But what was the reform movement? Where did it come from? It came from Germany. And at least one part of it was, let's make the practice of Judaism more German. Because we're Germans. Okay, not diminishing our Judaism, but we're Germans. Okay, this is our land, our people. And so our religion can fit here. And so it was absolutely wrong to say that the Jews of Germany had not assimilated. What's correct to say is that it hadn't saved them from this. Now there's, what you say there is, what do you learn from this spectacle? Well, maybe that might not be what this writer wanted to say, but it's something we could say. Assimilation does not necessarily save you if you're a persecuted minority. Things can come up. So they say, we must be eternally vigilant. American Negroes always keep in mind and not lapse into any false sense of security. Mob psychology can be whipped up by conscienceless and ambitious propagandists. And then, you know, people can be inflamed to target the group. And so the writer says, we don't adequately support the NAACP. It's a great organization, but we're not supporting it enough. Now it goes on to say, and this is the part that I think is really goes to show that the writer here is not understanding where things were going. Okay, it's interesting to note how efficient, smooth-running defense machines enabled the Jews to bring pressure on the Hitler government. Last week, 3 resolutions were introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives protesting against German anti-Semitic pogroms. Congressmen vied with each other to serve the Jewish people in their hour of adversity. Why? Because the Jews are powerful. And they are powerful because they're organized. 4 million American Jews have more influence on Congress than 12 million Negroes. Not just because they have votes and know how to use them, but because they're able to bring financial and commercial pressure to bear on those who oppose them. By the way, did the Jews of America have that much power? They absolutely did not. But to this writer, it looked like they did. Okay, and he goes on to say, in the end, the Nazis will back down. Just as Henry Ford backed down, the Jews have the kind of organization that's hard to beat. Negroes could learn much by watching the methods of the Jews and emulating them. By the way, is that anti-Semitic? Absolutely not. There's no intent there to criticize the Jews. In fact, what the writer is saying is, we need to be more like that. Okay, no, it turns out to be completely wrong. I shouldn't say is it anti-Semitic, I say is the intent anti-Semitic. Okay, and I don't think the intent is. Okay, but it also doesn't, it turns out not to be true. Okay, and so you'll get that in the press. And if you use newspapers with your kids, remember this thing about it being the first draft of history. Okay, but also this tells us in 1933, was it a foregone conclusion that the Nazis were going to last? Absolutely not. You didn't know it at the time. Okay, so let's go on. Okay. This is, I just wanted to give you one of these that I could have picked 100 of them that's kind of got an edge to it. White Americans of liberal persuasion are protesting about how Germans are treating the Jews. This is all well and good. American Negroes sympathize with the victims of Hitler terror in Germany, but they wonder why these prominent American white people did not take an equal interest in the lynch terror in America. What's been happening to Jews and liberals in Germany has been happening to the colored citizens of the United States. They too have been lynched, deported, persecuted, and proscribed. Is that a false statement, by the way? It is absolutely not a false statement. So the writer goes on to say, we do not say that the protest should not be registered against Hitler. In fact, we join in the protest, but like charity, the protest begins at home. By the way, I'm sure that a lot of people are familiar with the fact that a lot of the leadership in the African-American community in this day, still to this day now, but I mean in this time, was through the church. Okay, these Christian churches. There's a verse in Christian scripture that is repeatedly written into the newspaper. Why are you trying to take the splinter out of, you know where I'm going with this? Why are you trying to take the splinter out of your neighbor's eye while you have a beam sticking out of yours? Take the beam out of your eye first, and then you'll be able to see clearly to take the splinter out of your neighbor's eye. And I say, I came across that 24 times in the research I was doing in more than one paper. Okay. One other thing that I thought, just this tiny little mention, but it was really important. There was a conference of Baptist pastors in Germany. It was worldwide, but it was held in Berlin. And earlier in the article, they said, you know what? They had some misgivings about the fact that this was going to happen in Nazi Germany. We know how hostile they are, but they let the conference go on, and it was fine. But one of our members at the conference sat next to this German guy who was the father of the mayor of Munich, and was talking to him about this thing with the Jews. And he said, Nazis recognize the equality of all races before God. However, when a race is destructive by nature, then a government is forced to do to it what that race wanted to do to the nation as a whole. Okay, this is something that was just a little throwaway line in this article, but it's the essential element of Nazism. It's not just anti-Semitic. It doesn't just teach that Jews are inferior or that they don't fit in. It teaches that they're a disease in the body of humanity and has to be eliminated for the survival of the patient. That makes what they talk about, if Germany follows that line of reasoning through its ideology into behavior, what do you get? Ultimately, when it can happen, what do you get? What was the fourth stage? You get genocidal mass murder. Yeah, you get, and there's a famous speech that was given by Heinrich Himmler in the city of Poznan to his SS leaders. And in that speech, he said, we had the moral right and the duty to kill that people that was trying to kill us. Okay, that's what they're saying. And this is an article, 9 years before that, that just is stated by a random doctor in Germany. And so I think, you know, if you look carefully at the press, you can see some of this. Look, there's all sorts of arguments now. I know that I'm in my last few minutes. So after Kristallnacht, there was an article in the Daily Oklahoman. That's not a black paper, by the way. But the writer of the editorial said, for several years, we've had this bill in Congress, it's the anti-lynching bill. And one of the provisions in that is that if a lynching takes place, if the bill's passed and the lynching takes place, the community has to pay the sum of money to the victim. And he says, that's not right. It's just like what the Nazis have done to the Jews in Germany, where they got beaten up and their property was destroyed and then they got fined. By the way, is that just the same? Absolutely not. I mean, they're the victims. In this case, he's saying in a community that lynches somebody, the fact that the citizens of the town have to pay damages is the same as in Germany when the Jews who got beaten up had to pay damages. So it's a very different thing. And so having read that, the editor of the local black paper in this city called the Black Dispatch, he writes back a stinging rebuttal. And to their credit, the Daily Oklahoman actually published it in full, along with their previous editorial. And I didn't put it in full here, but I'll give it to you full in the folder. But basically what he says is the people in the town, when somebody's lynched, are not innocent. Because the lynching wouldn't have happened if the people of the town hadn't acquiesced in allowing it to happen. Furthermore, if it did actually happen, you know, in some kind of an outbreak of mob violence, the perpetrators would be caught and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. That's not what's happening. So this anti-lynching law would be designed to bring about conditions where this kind of mob violence wouldn't happen. Of course, did that anti-lynching law pass? In this time, did we get an anti-lynching law in the 1940s?
Not federal.
No. By the way, when did the United States finally pass a federal anti-lynching law?
This year.
Yeah, this year, 2022. Before that, over 200 bills, the federal anti-lynching bills failed. Over 200. Now, just so that you don't feel too bad about this, before the one that passed in 2020 or 2022, the last major attempt was in the middle of the 1960s. Okay, but the United States Senate, which is where these always failed, apologized for not passing anti-lynching legislation in 2005. That seems awfully late to me, by the way. But anyway, it happens. Okay. Great political cartoons too. When I give you the stuff in the folder, you get the cartoons, but you also get a couple of editorials that went along with it that are really interesting, and including one. Did I do that?
No, I did that. I apologize.
Okay. There was another scathing editorial, kind of like the one that I showed you a few minutes ago, that was really, really critical of America's response to anti-Black issues. And then they got a letter from a professor at Howard University. And the letter basically says, I understand what you're saying in your letter, but you're wrong. Okay, the United States is not like Nazi Germany. You're overstating the case. It says what you fail to see is that the fiendishness of the Nazis against a handful of remaining Jews is not only officially dictated, but also aims at the wholesale extinction, not of a handful, but of 700,000 Jews. What is now happening is the despoliation of an entire people. So you have a professor at Howard who understands. He's foresighted enough to see where this is going. But were most people that foresighted? At this point, right after the November pogrom, Kristallnacht, that's for some people, for a lot of people, that was just the first minute. But now what we're doing is we're getting there for people who can actually look forward. Lots of other articles. There was when the war came, and of course we're not quite into Pearl Harbor yet, but you get increased education for to allow Black servicemen to serve in full capacity throughout the armed forces, and you get President Roosevelt's executive order to at least try to eliminate discrimination in the defense industries. So segregated military, we don't get rid of that until President Truman and after the war, but but get rid of it at least theoretically in the defense industries. That was a bit of a success. Familiar with Charles Lindbergh? Okay, here's an editorial about Lindbergh's infamous speech in Des Moines, Iowa. And this member of the African American press: "We Negroes are not surprised at Lindbergh, because for many years he's thrown his contempt for Negroes and all non-Nordics. His early pronouncements on the World War emphasized the danger to the white races. Lindbergh sounded like a combination of Hitler, Lothrop Stoddard, and Thomas Dixon in his views on the darker races. Now against the Jews, he makes a speech which could have been written in Dr. Goebbels' office in Berlin." Pretty strong stuff there. But this is African American response to what's happening from the leadership of the community. So lots of great things. And a lot of the articles I'm going to give you are from the Pittsburgh Courier. First of all, because I have a subscription that allowed me to print from that more than some of the others. But they were also the instigators, the originators of what's called the Double V campaign. Are you familiar with the Double V campaign?
Yes.
Okay, well, Double V campaign is great. You also get the entire editorial letter from James G. Thompson, who's just a citizen. This is a letter he writes, but he says, my truest desire is to fight for the country, win a complete victory over the forces of evil, but I wonder if we could also get another victory at the same time. Not only victory over fascism, but victory over racism at home. Double V. And it's a wonderful full editorial. I recommend to you that you use it teaching your kids. And this is the last one. During the war years, a lot of the critical views that you see in the black press have completely disappeared. Because what happens when the country goes to war? Yeah, unity. People pull together. You don't see a lot of the same criticism. What you see is we're fighting for our country. We're fighting for the rights of all people. And of course, you have the NAACP coming out with a statement: unqualified and unlimited effort in behalf of the persecuted Jews of the world, which includes fighting against anti-Semitism in the United States. Civilized human beings throughout the world of every race, creed, and color stand appalled at the cold-blooded campaign of extermination of the Jews inaugurated by Adolf Hitler. It's not enough to be shocked by the crime, however. It's not enough to denounce it. The most effective means of ending the slaughter is the extermination of Hitler and Hitlerism wherever they exist. What does that mean, by the way? Now, this is 1943, so we're in the war, right? Okay, so what does that mean? It means let's win the war. Okay, we got to win the war in order to be effective at ending Nazism. By the way, isn't it usual these days that when you have like the issue of should the United States have bombed Auschwitz, that comes out as a criticism when the answer had been, we got to win the war first? But rapid victory would have saved more lives than anything else. Now, that's not to say that maybe the camp or the railroad approaches to the camp couldn't have been bombed. I'm just saying that even if they had been, it wouldn't save as many lives as the war ending 6 months sooner. Okay, so let's win the war. And that's what's being said there. Okay. Do we have any time for questions or no?
We're at 7 minutes over.
Oh, okay. Well, then we don't.
but Mitch can always answer questions via the app if you want to post. Either if you're here in person, you can ask Mitch questions afterwards, and I guarantee you he will stop to answer any question that you have. Everybody online, if you have a question to ask, you can post it in the Q&A. And Mitch has become tech savvy enough to actually be able to hop in and answer those questions. We're going to do a quick switch over here briefly. Thank you so much.
Please tip your waiters.
I would.
Yeah. Yes.
Isn't that gonna be?
Yeah, the PowerPoint's going to be posted. Everyone online, so I'm going to do a quick brief test to make sure you can hear me. We're going to do something different because I believe that Mitch was emitting some type of electrical interference. No, I mean that's why I'm curious, because everyone online is like, that's why we had to switch to this microphone over here. So I apologize. I told everyone there'd be a chance we'd have some tech issues with this wonderful new technology that we've got. So, but I do believe that was the case. I'm going to stop sharing real quick and go back to this here. I am going to see, just for the sake of, see if this will actually work right here. So, Delaney, if you could, or Kiara, could y'all check the comments? Can everyone online, if you could please tell me if you can hear me better or okay with this? Does this look like you can just give feedback and to see if you can hear? Because if Rabbi Engel is walking back and forth, I just want to test to make sure that everything can be heard better than it was on the other microphone. Just a couple seconds. Yep, testing. We're all good? Everyone can hear good? This way we don't have issues with the microphone, just in case, if you guys can all hear it. All right, so we'll be moving along through here. I'm not going to give, if you want to take a minute for just a break in the transition, feel free. We are going to have lunch after this, and everyone will be able to go to lunch. And if you have Q&A time, or if you need to have questions after for Rabbi Engel or for Mitch, feel free. If you need to take a break just for about 2 minutes. And we'll do a transition over. And that way we can get, Leia's going to get the whiteboard set up here, which we put together just for